Legal tender laws reverse that. Legal tender laws turn these pieces of paper into claims on the use of government force. A central bank note, because it can be used to make a legal tender, is a note that can be used to expropriate someone. And you can expropriate them legally because the government will not allow them to sue you for non-payment of a debt. The law effectively says you get their stuff even though they didn't get anything from you. So with legal tender laws, a government isn't only a protector of property, it's also an expropriator of property. The role of government changes from mere defense of property to expropriation. Let's go back to the example of the landlord. And let's assume that the landlord knows the law of legal tender, and he knows that if he doesn't take that central bank currency, he's not going to receive anything for the 1 month of room that he gave you. You might argue that because he agreed to be paid with that central bank money, he consented to the transaction, and that therefore it can't be said that he was in any way coerced. That line of argument is flawed. The fact that a person agrees to be paid with fiat currency, with currency that's subject to these legal tender laws, does not mean that they consented to the payment in that form. Now, let me walk you through a couple of examples to demonstrate that point. First, let's use an example that doesn't involve money per se. Imagine that your employer says to you, sign this letter of resignation and leave, or else I'm firing you. Now, in a situation like that, even if you sign the letter of resignation, you have not resigned. You've been fired. And that's why the law recognizes that fact. Even if you sign a letter of resignation, the common law recognizes that you were in fact coerced. That in fact it was a termination by your employer, it was not a voluntary resignation. The fact that you agreed does not mean that you consented. The same goes with fiat currency, with currency that is subject to legal tender laws. The fact that you agreed to be paid with central bank notes does not mean that you consented to be paid with those notes. The fact remains that you will have lost your opportunity to, for example, sue that tenant for non-payment of the rent. Either way, whether you accept payment or whether you don't accept payment in the form of those central bank notes, you lose the right to sue that tenant for the rent. You didn't consent to the loss of that right to sue. It was taken from you. The room was taken from you on terms that you didn't agree to. Now let's consider an example that does involve fiat currency, although not the kind you're used to. Imagine that you're willing to accept a fresh apple in exchange for a $1 silver coin. Now imagine that your government has passed a law, brand new law, saying that if a person tenders an apple core in exchange for a $1 silver coin, then whether or not you agree to accept that apple core as payment, you will be deemed by law to have been paid for that $1 silver coin. And the person who paid with that apple core, or attempted to do so, now owns the silver coin. You, on the other hand, are left with an apple core, having lost your silver coin to the person who tendered the apple core. That was an exchange that you would never have consented to, and that in fact you did not consent to. Even though you agreed to receive the apple in exchange for the coin, you were coerced into giving the coin in exchange for that apple core. You were coerced not only by the law, but ultimately by the person who used the law, the person who tendered that apple core. And if you take that apple core and turn around and use it to buy somebody else's $1 silver coin, you too will have coerced somebody. Non-fiat currency, things like gold coins and silver coins, do not give anyone the power to harm anyone. The fact that you own a gold coin or that you tender a gold coin does not mean that you have a right to take the person's property, or that any debt you may owe to him is erased. It's not the case. If they choose not to accept a gold coin or a silver coin as payment, because they never agreed to in the first place, well, you still owe for whatever it is you take from that person. And you owe whatever it is they and you agreed would be the adequate payment or the proper payment for that thing. The government does not involve itself in deciding what is deemed to be a payment. The parties are left to freedom of contract, the power to decide what will be traded for what. There's no coercion involved. In contrast, legal tender laws give everybody the power to coerce everybody else. the power to take goods or services from others without giving others the things they want in exchange. Legal tender laws, in short, give every man the right to expropriate his fellow man. You might argue that because most people don't know about legal tender laws, because they don't know that they can be expropriated if they don't accept central bank notes as payment, that there's no coercion involved, that all of these transactions we're doing with central bank currency are completely consensual. If a transaction does involve two or more people, none of whom know anything about legal tender laws, so that none of them realize they're using a tool of expropriation, then I would agree with you, there is no coercion involved. You might then go a step further and say that therefore fiat currency, central bank notes that are backed by legal tender laws, are not tools of coercion. That would be a step too far. Consider that rifles are tools of coercion even if everybody uses them as crutches and has no idea that they can be used to blow someone else's head off. The real question here is this. If it's true that nobody understands legal tender and nobody feels coerced when they're using central bank notes, shouldn't we just repeal legal tender laws and see if central bank notes retain their value? See if people continue to receive them as payment voluntarily? If your answer is no, consider what you're endorsing. And in any event, consider this. Even if it's true that nobody understands legal tender laws or the implications of legal tender laws, why has your government not repealed its legal tender laws?